9/11 was a pivotal moment in American history. The attack that killed almost 3,000 American citizens forever shaped the political landscape and foreign policy of the U.S. government and the way in which our country views Islamic extremism. The climate of fear and uncertainty present in the wake of the attacks gave rise to the U.S. government's program of enhanced interrogation. The abuses committed by this program violated many international laws and conventions involving torture and the mistreatment of POWs, and more closely resembled the abuses of a totalitarian regime rather than an enlightened democracy. The U.S. Enhanced Interrogation Program was essentially created a week after 9/11, when President Bush issued a secret directive authorizing the CIA to use, quote, an alternative set of interrogation procedures on suspected terrorist leaders taken into custody. The CIA employed many different torture techniques, some of which will be seen here in the photos from the infamous Abu Ghraib prison scandal. Individual phobias to induce stress. In this picture, we see a guard using a dog and the terrified look on the prisoner's face. Sleep deprivation by playing loud music and shackling prisoners in stress positions. According to the Senate Select Committee on Intelligence report that investigated the program, prisoners were often kept awake up to 180 hours at a time in these positions. Other common methods included humiliation, forced nudity, physical and sexual abuse, including beating, slapping, slamming prisoners into walls, and sodomy. And finally, waterboarding. These are just a few of the numerous methods the program employed. The UN Convention Against Torture defines torture as any act by which severe pain or suffering, whether physical or mental, is intentionally inflicted on a person for such purposes as obtaining from him information or a confession. The U.S. torture program fits this definition perfectly. The ironic part is, the United States has been a signatory of this convention since October 1994, yet the CIA's program clearly directly violated this international convention. The CIA's brand of torture also violated a number of U.S. laws prohibiting the practice, including the War Crimes Act and the Detainee Treatment Act. Yet, only a handful of lower-ranked personnel ever suffered for these crimes. The Bush administration may have blamed much of this torture on a few bad apples, such as the military personnel in the Abu Ghraib photos, but there is ample evidence to suggest that there was an institutional effort in the administration to ignore international and U.S. law in order to protect U.S. military and CIA personnel from prosecution. According to Fletcher and Stover in their paper Guantanamo and Its Aftermath, the Office of Legal Counsel, who advised the Attorney General and the President, issued a series of memos in January 2002 arguing that the Third Geneva Convention did not apply to captured Taliban or al-Qaeda fighters. Historian Arthur Schlesinger called this the most dramatic, sustained, and radical challenge to the rule of law in American history. The Senate Select Committee on Intelligence report on the torture program also revealed cover-ups by the CIA, including that the CIA avoided or impeded congressional oversight of the program, released inaccurate information regarding the program to the media, and subjected detainees to coercive interrogation techniques that had not been approved by the Department of Justice or CIA headquarters. Furthermore, the report revealed that even after it became apparent the intelligence gained from the torture was useless, the CIA continued to report their success in order to justify continued torture. All this evidence clearly points to a concerted effort by the administration and the CIA to cover up their efforts to avoid war crimes prosecution. Another interesting point is made by Michael Bryant in his paper America's Special Path. In this paper, he argues that the U.S. Enhanced Interrogation Program was comparable to torture programs operated by totalitarian regimes such as the Nazis and Soviets in the early 20th century. In the paper, Bryant argues that there are two main points underlying the theory of torture in totalitarian regimes. The first is the identification of a, quote, objective enemy. In The Origins of Totalitarianism, Hannah Arendt calls the objective enemy the foundation of the totalitarian political system, the mountain glacier that feeds the toxic valley streams of its criminality. For Hitler and the Nazis, These objective enemies were communists, socialists, Jews, and other enemies of the regime. For Stalin and his cronies, they were counter-revolutionaries or enemies of the people. But for both leaders and their regimes, this labeling was simply a way to suspend civil and human rights for these groups of people and justify their brutal repression and eventual torture. We can draw similarities between these totalitarian regimes and the events that occurred in the United States after 9/11. Specifically, the manipulation of the term enemy combatant or unlawful combatant by the Bush administration was simply another identification of a, quote, objective enemy. This label allowed the Bush administration and the CIA to justify their brand of torture by stripping suspected terrorists of their civil and human rights under U.S. law. The second point in the theory of torture in totalitarian regimes is the creation of, quote, special law. Both Stalin and Hitler created a constant state of emergency within their countries to justify the suspension of the normal rule of law and allow their abuses of power to run unchecked. Hitler used the Reichstag fire of 1933 to create a state of emergency that allowed him to suspend normal law, repeal the Constitution, and seize power. Stalin modified Section 136 of the Soviet Code of Criminal Procedure to allow torture in cases of political crime, which, as we can see now, ended up justifying countless acts of abuse and torture of his citizens under his regime. Likewise, we see a similar shift in America after 9/11. On September 14, 2001, President Bush declared a, quote, national emergency following the attacks. Then, 3 days later, he signed his famous directive allowing the CIA to conduct covert operations without the need to seek authorization. This led directly to the CIA's program of enhanced interrogation. Clearly, President Bush used this national emergency as justification for his administration's own brand of special law, and to suspend the due process of law for the individuals captured in Iraq and Afghanistan. While obviously the excesses of the Bush administration were eventually reined in through media scrutiny and congressional oversight, the parallels between our torture program and those of famous totalitarian regimes is still extremely interesting. American, quote, enhanced interrogation more closely resembles the abuses of a totalitarian regime in the mold of Stalin or the Nazis, rather than the democratic ideal the government is supposed to represent. All in all, we can see that the enhanced interrogation program put into place after 9/11 was excessive, illegal, and undemocratic. This dark period in American history will forever be a stain on our national identity.